Most people think Fifth Avenue's rise was built on elegance, old money, and the steady hands of families who shaped New York's destiny. But the story of Mrs. Astor's mansion begins with something far more volatile. Before the marble halls, before the famous ballroom that crowned Gilded Age society, there was an overseas trade in opium, counted in crates, measured in silver, and carried across oceans under the American flag. This house was more than a palace. It was a monument meant to bury the truth, and tonight we're going to exhume it. The year is 1816, and a young German immigrant named John Jacob Astor is about to make a decision that will change his family's trajectory for generations. He's already wealthy. His fur trading empire stretches from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Northwest. But Astor sees something his competitors don't. The China trade isn't just about tea and silk anymore, it's about opium. American merchants had watched British traders grow obscenely rich from the narcotic flowing into Chinese ports. By the 1820s, Astor's ships were carrying Turkish opium purchased in Smyrna, sailing it to Canton and returning with Chinese goods that commanded extraordinary prices in American markets. The profit margins were staggering. A single successful voyage could return 300% gains. Here's what that looked like in practice. In 1816, Astor's ship Macedonian carried 10,000 pounds of Turkish opium to Canton. The cargo was valued at $50,000, roughly 15 million in today's currency. The return trip brought tea, silk and porcelain that sold for $150,000 in New York. One voyage, $100,000 in profit. And Astor ran multiple ships simultaneously. The ledgers don't lie. Between 1816 and 1827, Astor's vessels made at least 20 documented opium runs to China. Conservative estimates suggest he moved over 200,000 pounds of opium in that decade alone. The profits didn't stay offshore. They flowed directly into Manhattan real estate at the exact moment the city was exploding northward. This wasn't coincidence. It was strategy. In 1811, New York's commissioner's plan had laid out the grid system that would define Manhattan's future. Astor understood what this meant. Property values would skyrocket as the city expanded upward from its southern tip. While the opium ships sailed, Astor quietly began buying farmland on Manhattan's undeveloped western edge. Land that cost hundreds per acre in 1820 would be worth thousands by 1850. The transformation was mathematical. Astor would purchase a plot for $500, hold it for a decade, then sell or lease it for $20,000. The drug money became land. The land became buildings, the buildings became rent, and rent became respectable. By the time John Jacob Astor died in 1848, he was the richest man in America. His $40 million fortune, equivalent to roughly $140 billion today, made him wealthier than the entire US Treasury, and nearly all of it came from two sources, opium and Manhattan real estate. But here's what matters for our story. Astor's son, William Backhouse Astor, inherited this fortune with a specific mandate: make the money permanent, make it legitimate, make it powerful enough that no one would dare question where it came from. William executed this perfectly. He expanded the real estate holdings. He married into the Schermerhorn family, adding their merchant wealth to the Astor coffers. And most importantly, he created the social architecture that would transform his family from rich merchants into American aristocracy. But William didn't complete the transformation. That fell to his son's wife, Caroline Webster Schermerhorn Astor, the woman who would become known simply as Mrs. Astor. When Caroline married William Backhouse Astor Jr. in 1853, she entered a family with unlimited wealth but uncertain social standing. Money alone didn't guarantee respect in 19th century New York. The old Knickerbocker families, the Livingstons, the Stuyvesants, the Van Rensselaers, looked down on the Astors as crude merchants. Rich, yes, but not refined, not cultured, not them. Caroline refused to accept this. She possessed something far more dangerous than wealth, ambition paired with strategic intelligence. She studied European aristocracy and understood their fundamental tool: control access, define the rules, become the gatekeeper. Over the next 2 decades, Caroline systematically built a social machinery that would make her family's position unassailable. She hosted elaborate dinners. She cultivated relationships with European nobility. She weaponized exclusivity. And most brilliantly, She created a number that would define an era, the 400. This wasn't arbitrary. Caroline's ballroom at her first residence could hold approximately 400 guests, so she declared, through her social lieutenant Ward McAllister, that there were exactly 400 people in New York society worth knowing. Everyone else simply didn't exist. The genius was in the scarcity. You couldn't buy your way into the 400. You couldn't earn it through achievement. You had to be chosen, invited, recognized, and only Mrs. Astor held that power. But Caroline understood something crucial. Symbolic power requires physical manifestation. She needed a throne room, a temple, a space that would embody her authority in stone and marble. In 1893 she would build it. The location was perfect. 840 Fifth Avenue, at the corner of 65th Street. Far enough uptown to avoid the commercial chaos of lower Manhattan. Close enough to Central Park to project refinement, and directly in the path of where New York's wealthiest families were relocating as the city pushed northward. The architect was Richard Morris Hunt, the same man who would design the breakers for the Vanderbilts. His commission, create a French, Renaissance chateau that would dwarf every other private residence in the city, not just in size, in significance. Caroline Astor's vision was crystallizing. The mansion would be more than her home. It would be the physical embodiment of social power in America. A place where wealth, no matter its origins, could finally become indistinguishable from legitimacy. The foundation was laid, the fortune secured, the social system designed. Now came the building itself, and what that building demanded would reveal everything about the machinery required to sustain such grandeur. Construction began in 1893 with a budget that would astonish even by Gilded Age standards. The estimates vary, but contemporary accounts suggest Caroline spent between $200,000 and $300,000 on construction alone, equivalent to roughly $8 million today. And that was before furnishings, before artwork, before the operational infrastructure. Hunt's design was deliberately overwhelming. The exterior featured limestone imported from French quarries. The entrance hall stretched 40 feet with double-height ceilings supported by marble columns. The famous ballroom, Caroline's primary weapon, measured 50 feet by 30 feet and could accommodate exactly 400 guests when properly arranged. Every detail was calculated, every material chosen to communicate permanence. The marble alone tells a story. 17 varieties were used throughout the mansion, sourced from quarries in Italy, France, and Vermont. Each had to be selected, cut, transported across oceans, then lifted into place by teams of craftsmen who understood how stone becomes architecture. The staircase featured Caen stone from Normandy. The ballroom floor was parquet from Germany. The fireplaces were carved from single blocks of marble weighing 3 tons each. But material is only half the story. The other half is labour. We know from city records that the construction crew averaged 75 workers daily over 18 months. Stonemasons, carpenters, plasterers, painters, glaziers, metalworkers, each a specialist in their craft. They worked 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. The math is straightforward. 75 workers times 500 workdays times 10 hours equals 375,000 hours of human labour embedded in the mansion's walls. That's 43 years of one person's life, compressed into 18 months of collective effort. And once built, the mansion required an entirely different kind of labour to maintain. The household staff numbered between 40 and 50 people at any given time. This wasn't unusual for Gilded Age mansions. What was unusual was the precision with which Caroline organised them. She ran her house like a military operation, with clear hierarchies and specific duties. The butler managed the front of house, the public-facing spaces where guests would interact. Beneath him, footmen, doormen, and serving, staff. The housekeeper controlled the private quarters, supervising chambermaids, laundresses, and the seamstresses who maintained the family's enormous wardrobe. The chef commanded the kitchen, aided by multiple sous chefs and scullery maids. Then came the invisible workers, the ones guests never saw, coal handlers who fed the mansion's dozen furnaces, burning through several tons weekly during winter, lamplighters who cleaned and filled the gas fixtures before electricity arrived, the night watchmen who patrolled the halls, the stable hands who maintained the carriage horses and vehicles, the groundskeeper and gardeners who kept the modest city plot immaculate. Let's talk numbers. A household this size required approximately $100,000 annually just for staff salaries. $3 million today. That doesn't include their housing, their uniforms, their food. Add another $20,000 for coal, gas, and water. $15,000 for food supplies, $10,000 for maintenance and repairs, $20,000 for wine and spirits for entertaining, $165,000 per year, every year, just to keep the house functioning. But Caroline's expenses went far beyond basic operations. She hosted formal dinners multiple times weekly during the social season, November through March. Each dinner required specific china patterns, specific glassware, specific silver services. She owned table settings for 200 guests. The inventory of her silver service alone, documented when the estate was catalogued, included 300 dinner plates, 400 forks, 600 spoons, and 200 serving pieces. The ballroom events demanded even more resources. A single ball might cost $15,000 once you factored in flowers, musicians, catering for 400 guests, and the small gifts Caroline gave to attendees. She hosted at least 6 major balls annually. That's $90,000 in entertainment costs alone. Add it up. The mansion consumed roughly $300,000 per year in total operational costs. That's $10 million in today's money. To live like royalty required the cash flow of a major corporation. And here's what's remarkable. Caroline could afford this easily. The Astor real estate holdings were generating over $5 million annually by the 1890s. The mansion's operational costs represented just 6% of the family's income, less than they paid in property taxes. This reveals the fundamental truth of Gilded Age wealth. It wasn't about spending money. It was about spending so much money so effortlessly that the spending itself became a form of power. A demonstration that your resources were infinite, that the normal economic constraints binding ordinary humans simply didn't apply to you. But Caroline used the mansion for more than display. She used it as an instrument. The social machinery she'd built over decades found its perfect expression in the ballroom at 840 Fifth Avenue. Every detail was weaponized. The invitation process alone was an elaborate ritual. Ward McAllister served as her social secretary, but Caroline personally approved every name. An invitation to Mrs. Astor's ball wasn't just a social event, it was confirmation that you existed in New York society. The dress code was absolute. Men wore white tie, women wore ball gowns that cost thousands of dollars, gowns they might wear only once because Caroline expected novelty. Her own gowns were created by Worth of Paris, the most expensive designer in the world. A single dress might cost the equivalent of a working man's annual salary. The balls followed rigid protocols. Guests arrived at precisely 9:30. Caroline received them in the ballroom, wearing her full complement of jewellery, including her famous diamond tiara that contained 200 carats of stones. The dancing began at 10. Supper was served at midnight, with guests arranged at tables according to careful social calculus. The event ended at 2 in the morning, and you left when Caroline left. This wasn't entertainment, it was social engineering. Caroline understood that by controlling who attended, who sat with whom, which debutantes were presented, and which families received recognition, she could shape New York's power structure. Business deals were made in her ballroom. Political alliances formed. Marriages arranged. Fortunes merged. The mansion became the physical location where America's ruling class assembled, recognized each other, and reproduced their power. And almost no one questioned the foundation it stood on. The general public saw Caroline's philanthropic donations. They read about her elegant dinners in the society pages. They admired the mansion's architecture from the sidewalk. The narrative was polished smooth. The Astors were American aristocracy, cultured, refined. Their wealth was simply a fact, like gravity. The opium ships were forgotten. The Chinese addicts who purchased the Astor's product had no place in this story. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 had already written Asian people out of American society. Their suffering was invisible, their addiction erased from memory. The mansion's beauty obscured its origins, the marble halls absorbed the moral complications, and Caroline's social dominance seemed natural, inevitable, deserved. This was the transformation completed. Questionable capital becomes real estate. Real estate becomes social authority. Social authority becomes legitimacy, and legitimacy becomes invisible. The system had worked perfectly, but systems, like mansions, require maintenance, and by the mid-1890s cracks were beginning to show. The first crack appeared not from external pressure, but from within the family itself. William Waldorf Astor, Caroline's nephew by marriage, refused to accept her supremacy. William Waldorf was the grandson of the first William Astor, by birth order and male primogeniture. The way European aristocracy worked, he believed he should lead the family. He was wealthy, educated, and intensely proud. He'd served as US minister to Italy, immersing himself in European aristocratic culture, and he despised that an American woman, his aunt, held more social power than he did. The conflict erupted publicly in 1890. William Waldorf's wife, also named Mary Astor, began referring to herself as Mrs. Astor, claiming that as the wife of the eldest son of the eldest son, she was the rightful heir to the title. Caroline, who had held the name for nearly 4 decades, refused to yield. What happened next was pure architectural warfare. William Waldorf owned the property directly adjacent to Caroline's original residence on 34th Street. In 1891, he demolished his own home and announced plans to build the Waldorf Hotel, a massive, luxurious establishment that would transform the quiet residential block into a commercial district. The message was clear. If he couldn't dominate society, he'd destroy its geography. Caroline was forced to retreat. She abandoned her 34th Street mansion and commissioned the Fifth Avenue chateau we've been discussing. William Waldorf responded by building an even taller hotel addition. The combined Waldorf-Astoria Hotel would eventually rise where both family mansions once stood. The feud revealed something crucial. Even within the Astor family, power was contested. The unity Caroline projected was fragile, and when William Waldorf finally abandoned America entirely, moving permanently to England where he could purchase an actual aristocratic title, it demonstrated that American social supremacy wasn't enough for everyone who possessed it. But family drama was only the beginning. Far larger forces were destabilizing Caroline's carefully constructed world. New fortunes were emerging that dwarfed even the Astors' wealth. The Vanderbilts had built a railroad empire that generated annual revenues exceeding the Astor real estate income by tenfold. Cornelius Vanderbilt II's mansion, completed in 1883 on Fifth Avenue, was larger and more opulent than anything the Astors possessed. His summer cottage, the Breakers in Newport, cost $7 million and required a staff of 40 just for seasonal occupation. The Fricks, the Carnegies, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, these names represented a new category of wealth based on industrial capitalism rather than inherited land. They built steel mills, oil refineries, financial empires. Their money multiplied faster than real estate values could ever appreciate, and they didn't particularly care about Caroline's approval. This created an impossible situation. Caroline's power rested on her ability to grant or deny social legitimacy. But what happened when people became so wealthy they could simply purchase their own legitimacy, build their own palaces, create their own social circles? The 400 began to mean less. The balls continued, but younger millionaires found them stuffy and antiquated. They preferred yachting parties, trips to Europe, informal gatherings. Caroline's rigid protocols, which had seemed sophisticated in the 1870s, felt Victorian and constraining by the 1890s. The mansion itself was becoming outdated. Electric lighting was transforming how wealthy homes functioned. Indoor plumbing systems were revolutionizing domestic architecture. Telephones were changing communication. Caroline's chateau, built in 1893, already felt slightly behind the curve by 1895. But the most devastating challenge came from outside the elite bubble entirely. The Panic of 1893 had exposed just how fragile America's economic system really was. Banks failed, railroads collapsed, unemployment soared to 20%, breadlines formed in cities across the country, and the sight of Mrs. Astor's mansion, blazing with gaslight, hosting parties that cost the equivalent of 50 workers' annual salaries, began to generate not admiration, but resentment. Labour unrest was intensifying. The Homestead Strike of 1892 had turned violent. The Pullman Strike of 1894 paralysed rail traffic. Anarchist movements were organising. Socialist newspapers were publishing exposés about wealth inequality that wouldn't have been possible a generation earlier. Thorstein Veblen published The Theory of the Leisure Class in 1899, coining the term conspicuous consumption specifically to describe people like Caroline Astor. Jacob Riis's photography was showing middle-class Americans exactly what poverty looked like in New York's tenements. Often just blocks from Fifth Avenue mansions, the narrative was shifting. The Gilded Age elite were no longer seen as natural leaders or cultural sophisticates. They were parasites, monopolists, robber barons. Caroline felt the change. Her balls continued, but the cultural celebration they'd once generated was souring. Newspaper coverage became more critical. Cartoons in popular publications mocked the extravagance. Progressive politicians used the Astor mansion as an example of everything wrong with American capitalism. She tried to adapt, increased her charitable giving, made public statements about responsibility, opened her art collection for limited public viewing. But these were defensive moves. The fundamental system she'd built, where private wealth translated directly into social and cultural authority, was being questioned. And then came personal loss. William Astor Jr., her husband, had been declining mentally for years. By the late 1890s, he was incapable of managing family affairs. He died in 1892, leaving Caroline without her partner. Her son, John Jacob Astor IV, had his own ambitions and didn't share his mother's social obsessions. He was interested in inventing, in military service, in doing rather than being. Caroline found herself increasingly isolated. The social world she'd dominated for 40 years was fracturing. The mansion that had been her fortress was becoming her cage, and the city itself was transforming around her at a pace she couldn't control. Fifth Avenue was commercializing. The residential character of the street was eroding as businesses purchased properties and converted them. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, which Caroline had supported, was growing into an institution that didn't need her patronage. Central Park was democratized, accessible to everyone rather than the refined setting for elite promenades she'd envisioned. By 1905, Caroline was in her 70s. Her health was failing. The ballroom at 840 Fifth Avenue hosted fewer events. The 400, if anyone even remembered the term, included names Caroline didn't recognize. Women she'd never approved were now considered society leaders. The mansion stood, magnificent, perfectly maintained, still staffed by 40 servants, still filled with priceless art and furniture. But it was a monument to a power that had already passed. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor died on October 30th, 1908. She was 78 years old. The funeral was private, attended by family and a small circle of the old Knickerbocker elite she'd fought so hard to join. The newspapers covered her death, but without the reverence she'd commanded at her peak. The obituaries were respectful but brief. History was already moving on. Her son, John Jacob Astor IV, inherited the mansion and the family fortune. He had no interest in his mother's social games. He was an inventor, a soldier, a man who'd commanded a battery during the Spanish-American War. The ballroom gatherings stopped. The rigid social protocols dissolved. In 1912, John Jacob made a decision that would scandalize the remnants of his mother's social circle. He divorced his wife and married an 18-year-old girl named Madeline Force. The age difference, he was 47, and the scandal of divorce ended whatever social standing the Astor name still held in Caroline's carefully curated world. That same year, John Jacob and Madeline boarded a ship for their honeymoon return from Europe. The ship was the RMS Titanic. John Jacob died helping women and children into lifeboats. His body was recovered days later, with $2,500 in cash in his pockets, the equivalent of carrying $75,000 today. Even in death, the family's wealth was on display. The mansion at 840 Fifth Avenue survived another couple of decades, but without purpose. Madeline had no interest in maintaining the social throne. The servants were gradually dismissed. The ballroom stood silent. The building that had required $300,000 annually to operate was costing money without generating any return, social, cultural, or financial. By the 1920s, the economics of Fifth Avenue had fundamentally changed. Commercial real estate values had eclipsed residential values. A mansion lot was worth more empty than occupied. The property taxes on these enormous houses were becoming unsustainable, especially as family fortunes fragmented across multiple generations and inheritance taxes increased. In 1926, the decision was made. The mansion would be demolished, the property sold, the land redeveloped. The demolition took months. Workers dismantled what took 18 months to build. The marble was salvaged where possible, sold to other builders. The artwork and furnishings were auctioned, the chandeliers removed, the panelling stripped, and finally, the limestone walls came down, block by block. By 1927, 845th Avenue was gone. In its place, the Temple Emmanuel, one of the largest synagogues in the world. The irony would not have been lost on Carolyn. The site that had been the fortress of WASP social exclusivity was now a Jewish house of worship. The city had rewritten even the memory of her power. But here's what's remarkable. The Astor name survived everything the mansion didn't. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel, born from that family feud, became synonymous with luxury hospitality worldwide. The Astor family's philanthropic foundations continued funding cultural institutions. Libraries bearing the Astor name proliferated across New York. The real estate empire, though fragmented, continued generating wealth for multiple branches of the family tree. And most importantly, the opium origins disappeared entirely from public consciousness. If you ask most Americans today what the Astor fortune was built on, they'll say real estate. Maybe fur trading if they're historically literate. Almost no one mentions the Turkish opium shipped to Canton between 1816 and 1827. Those ledgers, sitting in archives, publicly accessible, are rarely examined. The connection between the mansion and the narcotic is severed in our collective memory. This wasn't an accident. It was the system functioning exactly as designed. The brilliance of transforming drug money into real estate was that real estate is permanent. It's legitimate. It generates income without producing anything morally questionable. The buildings themselves become the story, while the capital that created them fades into historical footnote. Caroline understood this instinctively. Her social engineering wasn't just about status. It was about completing the laundering process that her father-in-law had started. Take the opium fortune, run it through Manhattan land speculation, convert it into cultural authority, and by the third generation, no one remembers where the money came from. They only see the result, a family of American aristocrats. And it worked. It worked perfectly, for generations. But the mansion's destruction teaches us something that Caroline herself never learned. Physical grandeur is temporary. The marble crumbles, the limestone falls. The ballroom, that carefully calculated space designed for exactly 400 guests, becomes rubble, and then memory, and then forgotten entirely. What persists are the systems, the mechanisms that allow questionable capital to become legitimate power, the social structures that prevent us from asking uncomfortable questions about where wealth originates, the narrative machinery that produces stories about elegance and refinement while burying stories about suffering and exploitation. We live in a world still built by these dynamics. The developers buying Manhattan real estate today, the billionaires funding museum wings, the families whose names grace universities, we don't ask where their money came from. We accept their philanthropy. We celebrate their contributions to culture. And perhaps that's not entirely wrong. Wealth, once created, does need to move through society. Foundations do fund valuable work. Cultural institutions do require patronage. But there's a cost to this amnesia. The Chinese addicts who purchased John Jacob Astor's opium had names, families, lives destroyed by the substance that built 845th Avenue. The servants who worked 16-hour days to maintain Caroline's social machinery had dreams and ambitions beyond keeping the ballroom polished. The thousands of New Yorkers struggling in tenements, while Mrs. Astor spent $50,000 on a single party, they were real people with real grievances. When we look at Gilded Age mansions today, the ones that survived to become museums, we see beauty, architecture, craftsmanship, history. And those things are real. They deserve preservation and appreciation. But the complete story requires acknowledging what made that beauty possible. The systems of extraction, exploitation, and exclusion that converted human suffering in China and labor in Manhattan into marble halls and crystal chandeliers. Mrs. Astor's mansion is gone. The stones were scattered 90 years ago, but the truth it embodied remains. Respectability is often just power wearing a mask, and that mask is usually expensive enough that we're hesitant to look behind it. The question isn't whether we should condemn the past. The question is whether we're willing to examine the present with the same clarity, to ask about the foundation supporting the grandeur we see today, to understand that beauty and brutality often share the same address. Caroline Schermerhorn, Astor built a temple to legitimacy. She succeeded. and then the temple vanished, leaving only the lesson. Some truths can't be demolished. They can only be remembered or forgotten. And that choice ultimately is ours. The history of American wealth is written in the architecture it leaves behind and in the stories we choose to tell about those buildings. Mrs. Astor's mansion is gone, but the systems that created it remain, evolving with each generation. What other estate should we examine next? Which mansion story deserves to be told with this same unflinching honesty? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this exploration valuable, consider subscribing for more investigations into the hidden histories behind America's most famous addresses. The past is never as simple as the marble, halls suggest, and understanding that complexity helps us see our present more clearly.